from being perfect. But on that afternoon, the flashing lights were not there because of crime. They were there because of an HOA president, and the person she accused was my pregnant wife. The moment still feels unreal even now. A police cruiser sat in front of our house. Red and blue lights reflected off the windows of homes across the street. Curious neighbors slowly gathered along sidewalks, whispering to each other while pretending not to stare. And standing in the center of it all was the person responsible for the entire scene, Karen Whitmore, president of the Homeowners Association, self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood. She stood near the curb with a clipboard pressed tightly against her chest, her posture stiff with authority. Anyone who looked at her could instantly tell she believed she controlled everything happening on that street. And according to her, my wife wasn't supposed to be inside our house, not visiting, not living there, not even standing on the property, because Karen had decided that our home no longer belonged to us. Inside the house, my wife sat quietly on the couch with one hand resting on her stomach. 7 months pregnant, the nursery we had been building for weeks was only halfway finished. Boxes of baby clothes and tiny furniture pieces still covered the spare bedroom floor. Life inside the house was supposed to be about excitement and preparation. Instead, fear had taken over. The police officer who arrived looked confused. He kept glancing between Karen, the house, and the official-looking papers she held like proof of some great injustice. Even from inside the house, it was obvious that something about the situation didn't add up. But Karen didn't look confused. She looked confident, certain, like someone who believed she had already won. Outside, more neighbors began appearing in their driveways. The quiet suburb that loved to brag about peaceful living had suddenly become the center of a strange and uncomfortable scene. A pregnant woman inside her own home, an HOA president claiming that woman didn't belong there, and a police officer trying to understand how any of it made sense. For several minutes, the flashing lights painted the neighborhood in red and blue, while Karen pointed toward our front door with the determination of someone demanding justice. But the truth was much darker than anyone watching realized, because the papers Karen carried were not just complaints. They were eviction notices. Official documents claiming that the Homeowners Association had the power to remove us from property entirely. To anyone who didn't know the full story, the situation looked like a dispute between a resident and an HOA. But what no one understood yet was that Karen wasn't trying to enforce a rule. She was trying to take our house. And she was willing to drag the police into it, if that's what it took. The officer eventually approached the front door, his footsteps slow and uncertain. The flashing lights continued reflecting across the street as the entire neighborhood watched the moment unfold. Inside the house, my wife remained seated, breathing slowly and carefully, trying to stay calm for the sake of the baby. Stress wasn't something we could afford. Not now. Not with our lives about to change in a matter of weeks. Yet somehow a woman with a clipboard had managed to turn that peaceful moment into a confrontation involving law enforcement. From the outside, it looked like chaos. But the real chaos had started days earlier. It had begun with something small. An envelope. A single letter placed in our mailbox that should never have existed. That envelope carried the HOA logo printed boldly across the top and Karen Whitmore's name sign at the bottom. At first glance, it looked like the typical petty notice many homeowners receive from overly strict associations. The kind that complains about trash cans or lawn decorations. But the words inside that envelope were nothing like that. Instead of a warning, it was an eviction notice. According to the document, our home was in violation of HOA regulations and subject to removal from residency. The letter demanded that we vacate the property within 30 days or face immediate legal action. The moment I read those words, something felt completely wrong. We own the house. The mortgage documents were filed years earlier. Every payment had been made. Every property record was clear and legal. Yet somehow the HOA president believed she had the power to push us out. At first, I assumed it had to be a mistake, a paperwork error, something accidentally sent to the wrong address. But the next day proved that assumption completely wrong. Another letter arrived, then another, each one more aggressive than the last. Each one signed by the same name, Karen Whitmore, president of the HOA. By the third notice, It became clear that this was a mistake. Someone wanted us gone. And the strangest part was that we had never even had a problem with the association before. No violations, no warnings, no fines, just a sudden demand to leave our own home. A demand that escalated until police cars appeared outside our house while neighbors watched from their lawns. And that was the moment everything changed. Because once the eviction notices arrived, I started doing something Karen clearly never expected. I started digging. Property records, HOA documents, old neighborhood filings. The deeper I looked, the more one terrifying possibility started to form. There was something about our house that Karen didn't want anyone discovering. Something buried in years of paperwork. Something that could explain why she was so desperate to force us out before anyone asked questions. And once that truth started coming together, it became clear that the eviction notice wasn't the real story. It was only the beginning. The flashing police lights outside our house that afternoon were just the first sign of a much bigger conflict about to explode across the entire neighborhood. Because if Karen thought threatening a pregnant woman and calling the police would make us disappear quietly, she had made the biggest mistake of her life. And that mistake was about to lead straight into a courtroom, where the truth behind our home and Karen Whitmore's actions as HOA president would finally be exposed. But before any judge ever heard the case, before the evidence surfaced, before the police realized what was really happening, there was something I needed to do first. Explain exactly who I was, and how a quiet suburban home turned into the center of a legal battle that would eventually destroy the most powerful person in the neighborhood. My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story of how the president of our HOA tried to evict my pregnant wife from the home we legally owned, and how the flashing police lights eventually disappeared from our street that afternoon, but the tension they left behind didn't go anywhere. In neighborhoods controlled by strict homeowners associations, reputation travels fast. One unusual event can turn into the only topic people talk about for weeks. And now everyone in the neighborhood had seen something they couldn't easily forget. The president of the HOA had called the police on a pregnant woman inside the home she legally owned. Even the officer who had arrived that day seemed uncertain about what he had just witnessed. The situation clearly didn't feel like a normal HOA dispute, because the truth was simple. HOAs can fine people. They can send warning letters. They can complain about rules. But they cannot evict someone from a home they legally own. Yet Karen Whitmore was acting as if she had that power. And that was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about neighborhood regulations. Karen wanted something else. Something connected to our house. Something she believed she could get if we disappeared quietly. My name is Daniel Carter. Until recently, my life was simple. I worked a steady job, spent my weekends fixing things around the house, and looked forward to the biggest change our lives were about to experience. The birth of our first child. My wife, Emily, was 7 months pregnant when the first eviction notice arrived. That house meant everything to us. We bought it 3 years earlier after saving for nearly a decade. It wasn't the biggest home in the neighborhood, but it was perfect for starting a family. A quiet street, a small backyard, a spare bedroom that we had recently begun turning into a nursery. The moment we found out Emily was pregnant, the house suddenly felt even more important. Every room seemed to represent a piece of the future we had been waiting for. And then Karen Whitmore decided we didn't belong there. The strange part was that before the eviction letters, we had barely interacted with her at all. Karen Whitmore had been president of the HOA for almost 6 years. During that time, she had built a reputation across the neighborhood that ranged somewhere between strict and terrifying. Many residents joked about her behind closed doors, but no one ever challenged her openly. People described her as someone who treated HOA authority like personal power. She enforced rules with a level of intensity that made even minor mistakes feel like serious crimes. Cars parked incorrectly. Mailboxes painted the wrong color. Holiday decorations left up too long. Fines appeared quickly for anyone who didn't follow the rules exactly. Most people simply paid them and moved on, because fighting the HOA always felt like more trouble than it was worth. But the situation with our house was different. This wasn't a fine. This wasn't a warning. Karen Whitmore had officially demanded that we leave our own home. And the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why our house? Why now? Why threaten a pregnant woman with eviction? Those questions started to bother me more and more. The night after the police incident, while Emily tried to rest, I sat at the kitchen table with the stack of letters Karen had sent us. I read them over and over again. Something about the wording felt strange. The documents mentioned community authority over disputed property boundaries and HOA enforcement rights regarding restricted development zones. Those phrases sounded complicated, but something about them didn't feel real. They felt like someone trying very hard to make something look official. So I decided to do something simple. I checked the property records. At first, everything looked completely normal. The house had been built 22 years earlier. The original developer had created the entire neighborhood and later transferred control of the homeowners association to the residents. The previous owners had lived there for almost a decade before selling property to us. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But then I noticed something strange buried inside older documents connected to the land. Before the neighborhood existed, the property had once been part of a much larger estate owned by a local farming family. Years earlier, the land had been divided and sold to developers who eventually built the suburban community we lived in. But one section of paperwork mentioned something that immediately caught my attention: an access agreement, a legal document that referenced a small piece of land connected to our property. It was old, very old, and the more I looked at it, the more confusing things became. According to the document, the land connected to our house included a narrow strip of property that extended beyond the typical residential boundary lines. A strip of land that technically belonged to the original estate long before the neighborhood existed. Most of the document referred to historical access rights that probably hadn't mattered in decades. But one thing stood out clearly. The land attached to our house had never been transferred to HOA. Not when the neighborhood was created. Not when the association was formed. Not ever. It remained privately owned property connected to our deed. At first, I didn't understand why that mattered. But then a strange idea began forming in my mind. What if Karen Whitmore already knew about it? What if the eviction notices had nothing to do with rules? What if she believed removing us from the house would give the HOA control over that land? The thought sounded ridiculous. But the more I researched HOA disputes online, the more I discovered something surprising. Some associations had tried similar tactics before. Not eviction exactly, but pressure, threats, legal confusion designed to make homeowners leave voluntarily. And if Karen believed that land could somehow become HOA property once we were gone, that could explain everything. But if that theory was true, it meant something much more serious. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was attempting to manipulate property ownership. And if she was willing to call the police on my pregnant wife to make that happen, then this situation was far bigger than an HOA dispute. That night, I realized something important. The eviction letters weren't just intimidation. They were desperation. Karen needed us gone. And the more I learned about the history of our property, the clearer one thing became. If the truth about that land came out publicly, Karen Whitmore could lose everything. Her position, her authority, possibly even her freedom. But I still didn't know exactly what she was planning. And I had no idea how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. That answer came sooner than I expected. Because the next morning, before the sun had even fully risen over the neighborhood, another envelope appeared in our mailbox. This one wasn't just a warning. It was a legal notice. Karen Whitmore and the HOA had officially filed a case against us. And according to the document, they intended to force the eviction through court. But what Karen didn't realize was that by taking the fight into a courtroom, she had just opened the door to something she could no longer control. Because once lawyers and judges started looking at the property records connected to our home, the truth buried inside those documents was finally going to come out. And when it did, the entire neighborhood would discover exactly why the president of the HOA had been so desperate to push a pregnant woman out of her own house. When the legal notice arrived, the entire situation suddenly became real in a way it hadn't before. Threatening letters were one thing, but a court filing was different. Karen Whitmore and the Homeowners Association had officially escalated the conflict beyond neighborhood complaints and petty HOA rules. They had taken the matter to the legal system, asking a judge to approve the eviction of a homeowner from property that we legally owned. It was a kind of move that normally only happened in serious disputes involving unpaid mortgages or illegal activity. None of those things applied to us. Yet somehow the HOA president had convinced herself that the courts would support her decision. When I finished reading the document, a strange feeling replaced the anger that had been building for weeks. Relief, because Karen had just made the first real mistake of this entire situation. As long as everything stayed inside the HOA system, she controlled the rules. She controlled the fines, the warnings, the complaints, and the endless paperwork that made most residents too exhausted to fight back. But a courtroom was different. A judge didn't care about neighborhood gossip or HOA politics. A judge cared about evidence. And evidence meant property records. The same records I had already started examining. That realization changed everything. Until that moment, the eviction notices had felt like an attack we were forced to defend against. But once Karen filed the case, the balance shifted. Now someone outside the HOA would be forced to examine the details. And those details were starting to reveal something very strange about the land connected to our house. I contacted a property attorney the next morning. The lawyer's office was located downtown in a quiet building filled with businesses that handle real estate and financial disputes. Walking into that office felt surreal, like stepping into a situation far more serious than anything that should ever happen in a suburban neighborhood dispute. The attorney reviewed the eviction notice carefully. Then he read through the HOA complaint that Karen had filed with the court. The more he read, the more his expression changed. Confusion slowly turned into curiosity. Because the case Karen filed didn't just claim we violated HOA rules. It argued that the association had authority over the property itself. That claim alone made the situation unusual. But when the lawyer started examining the property records I had discovered, the entire case suddenly looked even stranger. The documents showed something that Karen's complaint completely ignored. The land attached to our home included a small extension that had never been transferred to HOA when the neighborhood was built. Most of the houses in our community sat on identical lots. Clean, simple property boundaries created by the developer when the neighborhood was designed. Our property was slightly different. A narrow strip of land ran behind the backyard fence and connected to a small wooded area that existed before the neighborhood was ever developed. The strip looked insignificant, almost like a forgotten piece of land no one ever used. But legally, it still belonged to the homeowner whose deed included it, which meant it belonged to us. The attorney spent nearly an hour reviewing historical maps, property filings, and HOA documents connected to the neighborhood. By the time he finished, he leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. The problem, he explained, was not the eviction notice itself. The problem was why Karen believed she could issue one in the first place. Because the homeowners association never had authority over privately owned land outside its official property boundaries. And according to the records, that strip behind our house was not part of the HOA's control. That fact raised a much bigger question. If Karen Whitmore knew about that land, and the documents suggested she probably did, then the eviction attempt started looking less like a misunderstanding and more like something deliberate, something strategic, something dangerous. The attorney also noticed something else buried inside older neighborhood records. Several years earlier, the HOA had attempted to expand a community park near the back of the development. The plan involved acquiring small pieces of surrounding land to connect the park to walking paths and open green areas. The expansion had never happened. The project was abandoned after funding problems. But the maps connected to the proposal showed something very interesting. One of the possible expansion routes passed directly through the strip of land attached to our property. The same strip Karen seemed desperate to control. Suddenly, everything began to make sense. If Karen could somehow force us out of the house, if the property changed ownership, if the HOA regained control of the land during that process, that strip might become available for the project again. And if the park expansion ever moved forward, the value of that land would increase significantly. The more we looked at the documents, the clearer the picture became. Karen Whitmore hadn't targeted our house randomly. She wanted that land. But her plan had one major flaw. She believed no one would question the eviction. She believed homeowners were too intimidated by the HOA to challenge her. She believed the threat alone would make us leave quietly. Instead, she had pushed the conflict into a courtroom. And that meant every piece of evidence would now be examined publicly. But Karen still didn't know that yet, because the next step in the legal process was a preliminary hearing, a short court session where both sides presented their basic claims before the case moved forward. Karen would explain why the HOA believed it had the right to remove us from the property. Our attorney would present the property records showing the opposite, and the judge would decide whether the case even deserved to continue. In most situations like this, the hearing would be quick and uneventful. But the attorney warned me about something important. People who abuse HOA power rarely back down easily. If Karen had gone as far as calling the police on my pregnant wife and filing an eviction lawsuit, there was a good chance she believed she had already secured victory. And people who believe they cannot lose often make reckless decisions. That warning proved accurate faster than anyone expected. 2 days before the court hearing, another incident shook the neighborhood. It happened early in the morning. Several neighbors later described hearing loud voices near the end of our driveway. When they looked outside, they saw Karen Whitmore standing near our mailbox again. But this time she wasn't alone. 2 security officers hired by the HOA stood beside her. Karen held another stack of documents in her hands. And according to the neighbors watching from across the street, she appeared furious. What happened next would become the second major mistake she made in this entire situation. Because instead of waiting for the court hearing like any responsible HOA president should, Karen attempted something far more aggressive. She tried to enforce the eviction herself. And that decision would trigger an event that none of us, including Karen, were prepared for. An event that would bring the police back to our street. But this time, the situation would not end the way Karen expected. The morning Karen Whitmore decided to enforce the eviction herself started quietly. The kind of quiet that suburban neighborhoods pride themselves on. Lawns glistened with early morning dew. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across front yards. And the sun slowly rose over rows of nearly identical houses. For most people on the street, it looked like another peaceful morning. But for us, the tension from the upcoming court hearing hung over everything. Our first hearing was scheduled in only a few days. Until then, we were trying to focus on normal life as much as possible. Emily spent most of the morning resting. At 7 months pregnant, even small amounts of stress could be exhausting. The nursery was still unfinished. Half-assembled furniture sat against the wall, and small boxes of baby supplies filled the corners of the room. Looking at those things reminded us why this fight mattered so much. This wasn't just about property. It was about protecting the home where our child would grow up. Around 8 in the morning, the first sign that something was wrong appeared outside. A dark SUV slowly turned onto our street and stopped directly in front of our driveway. Even before the door opened, I already knew who it was. Karen Whitmore stepped out of the vehicle with the same confident posture she always carried around the neighborhood. In one hand, she held a clipboard filled with documents. But this time, she wasn't alone. 2 men stepped out of the vehicle behind her. Both wore uniforms marked with the logo of a private security company. They stood beside Karen with the stiff, alert posture of people hired to enforce authority. The sight immediately made something in my stomach tighten. HOAs sometimes hired security for events or community patrols. But bringing security guards to a homeowner's property during an ongoing legal dispute was something entirely different. Karen began walking up our driveway as if she had every right to be there. The security officers followed a few steps behind. Across the street, neighbors started noticing the scene. Curtains shifted. Garage doors paused halfway open. People quietly stepped onto their porches to watch. Karen Whitmore had turned our house into the center of another neighborhood spectacle. By the time she reached the front walkway, several people were already observing from a distance. She stopped near the porch and adjusted the papers on her clipboard. Then she knocked on the door. Once, twice, harder the second time. Inside the house, Emily sat on the couch, one hand resting gently on her stomach. The stress of the past few weeks had already been more than anyone should have to deal with during pregnancy. Seeing Karen outside with 2 security officers instantly made the situation feel even more threatening. I stepped toward the door and looked through the window. Karen stood there with a calm, almost satisfied expression. The security guards waited behind her like silent confirmation that she believed she had control of the situation. When I opened the door slightly, Karen immediately held up the papers in her hand. Her body language radiated authority. To anyone watching from the street, she probably looked like someone performing official HOA duties. But the documents she carried told a very different story. They were not court orders. They were not eviction approvals. They were simply the same HOA notices she had already sent before. Papers with no legal power. Yet Karen behaved as if the eviction had already been granted. Behind her, one of the security officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that the situation was unusual. But Karen continued standing there with complete confidence. She pointed toward the house and then toward the street, gesturing in a way that made her intentions unmistakable. She expected us to leave. Immediately, right then, it was a moment so absurd that for a second I almost laughed. The court hearing hadn't even happened yet. No judge had reviewed the case. No legal authority had ruled on the dispute. Yet the president of the HOA was attempting to remove homeowners from their property simply because she believed she had the power to do it. Across the street, several neighbors had now gathered near the sidewalk. Whispers moved through the small crowd. Phones appeared in people's hands as they quietly recorded what was happening. Karen Whitmore might have expected a private confrontation. Instead, half the neighborhood was witnessing her actions. The tension grew heavier with every passing second. And then Karen made a decision that would change everything. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Moments later, she was speaking rapidly while pointing toward our house again. The gesture was unmistakable. She was calling the police. Several neighbors exchanged surprised looks. Even the security officers appeared uncertain now. But Karen seemed completely convinced she was doing the right thing. Minutes passed slowly. The morning calm of the neighborhood had turned into an uncomfortable standoff. Inside the house, Emily tried to remain calm, focusing on steady breathing. Stress during pregnancy was dangerous, and the last thing either of us wanted was for this ridiculous situation to affect her health. Outside, Karen waited with her arms crossed. Eventually, the sound of sirens broke the silence. A police cruiser turned onto the street and pulled up near our driveway. Red and blue lights flashed against the houses again, drawing even more attention from curious residents. The same officer who had responded during the earlier incident stepped out of the vehicle. He immediately recognized Karen, and he immediately recognized our house. The officer walked toward the group slowly, his expression already showing signs of concern. Karen began explaining the situation while gesturing dramatically toward the house and the paper she held. From her body language alone, it was clear she was attempting to present herself as the victim of some kind of violation. But something about the scene clearly didn't convince the officer this time. He looked at the documents. He looked at the security guards. Then he looked toward the house where Emily sat inside. The confusion on his face slowly turned into something else. Suspicion. Because the more Karen insisted that the homeowners association had authority to remove residents from their property, the less believable the story became. The officer eventually asked Karen for the court order authorizing the eviction. Karen hesitated. For the first time since arriving that morning, her confidence appeared to weaken. Because the one document she needed to justify her actions did not exist. There was no court order. No judge had approved anything. Karen Whitmore had simply decided to enforce an eviction on her own. And the moment the officer realized that, the entire situation shifted. What Karen believed was a display of authority was beginning to look like something else entirely. Something far more serious. Because attempting to remove homeowners from their property without legal authority wasn't just an HOA dispute. It could be considered harassment, or even intimidation. And now there were witnesses. Lots of them. Neighbors continued filming from across the street. The officer spoke quietly with Karen for several minutes, reviewing the documents again and again. Each time he looked at them, his expression grew more concerned, because every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Karen Whitmore had crossed a line, and the worst part for her was something she still didn't realize. Those recordings from the neighbors' phones would soon become evidence. Evidence that our attorney would happily bring into the courtroom. Evidence showing exactly how far the president of the HOA had gone to force a pregnant woman out of her own home. And once that evidence reached the judge, Karen's entire case was about to collapse. But that wasn't the only problem she was about to face, because the next court hearing was only 2 days away. And by the time the judge reviewed everything Karen had done, the consequences would be far worse than losing an HOA dispute. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a tense quiet over the neighborhood. Even though it was a short drive downtown, Emily and I felt the weight of every previous moment pressing on us. As we approached the courthouse, the streets were empty compared to usual bustle, but inside, the courthouse was alive with a low hum of clerks, attorneys, and families waiting for hearings of all kinds. The scent of polished floors, paper, and coffee lingered in the air, familiar to anyone who has ever faced a legal battle, but foreign to us. This was unfamiliar territory, yet it felt like the only place where real justice could be enforced. We entered the courtroom and found our assigned seats. The walls were lined with wood panels that seemed to echo authority and history, as though every case tried here had contributed to an unbroken chain of precedent. My heart raced as I looked at Emily, seated beside me, her hand resting gently on her stomach. She looked nervous, but her eyes held determination. We had worked too hard, invested too much, and built a life in that house. We weren't leaving because someone with an inflated sense of power wanted to rewrite the rules. On the other side of the room sat Karen Whitmore, flanked by a small team representing the HOA. She was dressed in her usual sharp attire, her clipboard replaced by neatly organized folders of court documents. She sat upright, her posture perfect, her expression the same one she wore every time she believed she was untouchable. For a moment, I wondered if she realized how different the dynamics were in a courtroom. Out there on the street, she could shout, point, and intimidate. Here, she would be judged by facts and evidence, not by posture or aggression. The judge entered the room, and the quiet became complete. The gavel hit the bench once, and the proceedings officially began. The courtroom officer explained the case's purpose. A preliminary hearing to determine if the HOA had any legal basis to enforce eviction against a homeowner of record. Karen's attorney stood first, presenting the HOA's claim. He spoke with the kind of confidence that comes from assuming the judge would see the argument as routine. He read sections of the HOA rules aloud, emphasizing community property and enforcement rights. Every word was carefully chosen to make it sound like the HOA had overarching authority. But the moment he cited these so-called rights, I noticed the judge lean forward slightly, pen poised over a notebook. Subtle gestures in the courtroom often reveal more than spoken words, and this one told me the judge was already skeptical. My attorney, a calm and experienced man named Mr. Reynolds, waited quietly for the appropriate moment. He understood the strategy. Let the opposition present their case fully, then dismantle it piece by piece. When it was our turn, Mr. Reynolds stood, carrying a folder filled with property records, historical maps, and documentation proving that the strip of land behind our house was privately owned and had never been part of the HOA. He laid out the records systematically. Each page revealed the property's history, the legal boundaries, and evidence that Karen's claims were built on assumption rather than fact. The judge examined each document carefully, occasionally asking pointed questions that made the courtroom feel heavier. Has the HOA ever exercised control over the strip of land? The judge asked. Karen's attorney stammered slightly, unable to produce evidence that the association had ever done so legitimately. No, Your Honor, he admitted finally. Not in any formal capacity. That single admission shifted the atmosphere. Karen's aura of invincibility began to crack. Just slightly, but enough for everyone in the courtroom to sense it. Mr. Reynolds continued, walking the judge through the historical filings, each one meticulously showing that the HOA had never had the legal right to evict us. Every page reinforced the same conclusion. Karen Whitmore's attempts to remove us were baseless and entirely self-serving. The courtroom audience, which included a few curious neighbors and members of the public, began whispering quietly. They were witnessing a power dynamic unravel in real time, a neighborhood authority figure confronted by the law, unable to justify her actions. The whispering, though soft, added to Karen's visible tension. She shifted in her seat, glanced at her attorney, and then back at us. Her composure, one so formidable on the street, faltered under the quiet but uncompromising gaze of the judge. Then came the critical moment. The evidence from the morning confrontation outside our house. The neighbor's video recordings, previously just curious smartphone footage, now became pivotal. Mr. Reynolds handed copies to the judge. On the screen, Karen could be seen pointing at the house, gesturing aggressively, and instructing the security officers as she called the police. All before any court order had been issued. The footage showed her treating a pregnant woman as if she had no rights in her own home. The judge paused, watching each clip with growing scrutiny. And this was before any court action? The judge asked, turning to Karen's attorney. Again, no satisfactory answer came. Karen's plan, which relied on fear and intimidation, had failed spectacularly under the light of accountability. The courtroom atmosphere grew tense. Karen whispered something to her attorney, but it was too late. The preliminary hearing was no longer just a formality. The judge had seen the evidence. The case had transformed from an HOA dispute to potential harassment and intimidation. The power dynamic that Karen had relied on for years was collapsing in real time. Mr. Reynolds finished presenting our case, summarizing the legal and historical facts in a way that left no room for ambiguity. He emphasized not only our legal right to occupy the house, but also the HOA president's repeated overreach and misuse of power. The courtroom was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that amplifies the weight of every word spoken before. Finally, the judge addressed Karen directly. Based on the evidence presented here today, there is no legal basis for the HOA to evict these homeowners. The preliminary claim is dismissed. A collective sigh seemed to echo throughout the courtroom. Relief washed over Emily, her shoulders sagging slightly as she exhaled. I felt the tension in my chest ease, though only a fraction. While the preliminary hearing was a victory, the underlying issues and Karen's potential retaliation remained. Karen Whitmore's expression was unreadable. For the first time in years, she looked cornered. Her strategy of intimidation had failed publicly in front of judge and witnesses. She was no longer an untouchable figure in the neighborhood. Her aura of authority had been replaced with visible frustration, her eyes darting to the attorney's documents, the courtroom screen, and finally to us. Outside the courtroom, the news spread quickly. Several neighbors had attended the hearing and took to their phones to record snippets of the proceeding, whispering excitedly about the dramatic unfolding. Karen Whitmore's reputation, once untouchable, was now facing scrutiny not just in court, but across the neighborhood she controlled for so long. Even with the preliminary hearing dismissed, I knew this was not the end. HOA disputes, like many power struggles, rarely ended with a single legal setback. Karen could appeal. She could try to manipulate the rules again. But one thing had changed irrevocably. The intimidation that fueled her authority was now exposed for the world to see. That morning in court had become a turning point. The police involvement, the neighbor videos, the historical property evidence, all of it combined to show the truth clearly. Karen Whitmore had attempted to abuse her position, and the law had intervened. As Emily and I left the courthouse, the morning sunlight felt different. The air was sharper, the world more real. We had survived intimidation, police standoff, and legal threats, and our home and future child were still safe. But the story was far from over. Karen's desperation could lead to more attempts to assert control, and the next chapter of this battle was already taking shape behind the scenes. Even as we walked back to the car, walking out of the courthouse after the preliminary hearing felt like stepping into a different world. For weeks, everything in our lives had revolved around stress, threats, and uncertainty. Karen Whitmore had turned our quiet home into the center of a conflict that none of us expected. But the moment the judge dismissed the eviction attempt, something important changed. Karen no longer looked powerful. She looked exposed. Word travels fast in neighborhoods controlled by homeowners associations. And by the time Emily and I drove back home that afternoon, the story had already started spreading. Neighbors who had once stayed silent were now openly talking. Phones buzzed with messages. Social media groups connected to the neighborhood began filling with questions about what had happened in court. For years, Karen Whitmore had maintained control through fear and intimidation. Residents paid fines without arguing. They followed every rule she created, even the ridiculous ones. No one challenged her authority. But now people had seen something different. They had seen a judge reject her claims completely. They had seen evidence showing that she had tried to force a pregnant woman out of her own home without any legal authority. And most importantly, they had seen that Karen Whitmore could lose. The shift in the neighborhood atmosphere was immediate. Over the next few days, several homeowners began sharing their own experiences with the HOA. Stories surfaced about unfair fines, aggressive warnings, and threats that Karen had used to control residents for years. Many of those stories had never been reported before. People were afraid to speak up. Now that fear was fading. Our attorney called 2 days after the hearing with unexpected news. What had started as a simple property dispute was now attracting attention from people outside the neighborhood. The footage recorded by neighbors during Karen's attempt to enforce the eviction had become important evidence. The video clearly showed her attempting to remove homeowners without a court order while using security guards and police intimidation. That alone was serious. But when investigators began reviewing the HOA's financial records and authority claims, another troubling pattern started appearing. Karen Whitmore had been exceeding her legal authority as HOA president for years. Unauthorized fines, improper enforcement actions, and multiple attempts to pressure homeowners into giving up property rights connected to small pieces of land around the neighborhood. The strip of land behind our house wasn't the only property Karen had tried to gain control over. It was just the one where she had pushed too far. A formal investigation began soon after. At first, Karen attempted to defend herself publicly. She released statements claiming she had simply been enforcing HOA regulations and protecting the neighborhood. But those explanations quickly started falling apart. The property records were clear. The HOA had never owned the land connected to our home. Karen had known that, yet she still attempted to force us out. And once investigators reviewed her actions during the confrontation outside our house, the situation became even worse for her. Using intimidation tactics while falsely claiming legal authority could be considered harassment. Calling police to enforce a non-existent eviction order made the situation even more serious. Within weeks, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Residents filled the community center, where those meetings normally took place. For years, the room had been a place where Karen delivered long speeches about rules and violations. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. People were angry. They wanted answers. One by one, members of the board began distancing themselves from Karen's actions. They claimed they had not approved the eviction attempt and had no knowledge of the aggressive tactics she used. The pressure continued building until Karen Whitmore finally lost a position. The board voted to remove her as HOA president immediately. But the consequences didn't stop there. The investigation into her actions was still ongoing. Several weeks later, Emily and I received another phone call from our attorney. This time the news was even more serious. The authorities had filed charges related to harassment, intimidation, and abuse of authority connected to Karen's actions during the eviction attempt. The videos recorded by neighbors had played a major role in the case. Those recordings clearly showed Karen attempting to remove homeowners from their property without any legal authority. In court, those actions were impossible to explain away. Months later, the final hearing took place. This time the courtroom felt very different. Karen Whitmore no longer carried the confident posture she once displayed around the neighborhood. She sat quietly beside her attorney while the case against her unfolded. Evidence from the eviction attempt. Video footage from the confrontation outside our house. Property records proving the HOA had no legal authority over the land she was trying to control. One by one, the facts painted a clear picture. Karen Whitmore had abused her position as HOA president in an attempt to gain control of property that never belonged to the association. And when intimidation failed, she escalated the situation using police involvement and security guards. By the end of the hearing, the judge's decision was firm. Karen Whitmore was found responsible for harassment and abuse of authority related to the eviction attempt. The court imposed serious penalties, including fines and a period of jail time for the actions she had taken. For the first time since the nightmare began, the situation finally felt finished. Justice had been served. Months later, life slowly returned to normal in our neighborhood. A new HOA board took over, promising transparency and fair enforcement of community rules. The tension that once surrounded every interaction with the association slowly disappeared. Neighbors who had once avoided each other began talking again. The community started feeling like a neighborhood instead of controlled environment. At home, the nursery was finally completed. Soft blue walls, a crib near the window, small shelves filled with toys and books waiting for a child who would soon arrive. The house that Karen Whitmore had tried so hard to take from us became something even more meaningful. It became the place where our family truly began. A few weeks later, Emily gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Holding him for the first time made every stressful moment of the past months feel distant. Because in the end, the house had never just been about property. It was about protecting our future. Karen Whitmore had believed she could control everything in the neighborhood through fear. But the moment she tried to push a pregnant woman out of her own home, she made the biggest mistake of her life. And that mistake destroyed the power she had spent years building. Our home remained exactly where it had always been, right where our story began.